No More of This Land is a wonderful book, and I'm really excited to get to talk to you about it. But I am curious how the story came about. How long has this been percolating? How long have you wanted to tell this story? Yeah.
Probably like you, it's kind of been percolating for a very long time. I think it comes from growing up and seeing stories around and maybe not feeling like they're done the right way or totally identifying with them. But this particular book, the original sort of version of it started about 10 years ago when I was in grad school. And I really wanted to write a story about my tribe that was different from all the stories that I was seeing around there. And that version of the book sort of didn't really work, and I think one of the reasons it didn't work is because I hadn't done a lot of the work that you're describing of reporting and going out into other communities and doing this storytelling. And that's kind of how this version of the book came together, where it was bringing my tribe and my community, but also this sort of bigger global picture in.
Yeah, that bigger global picture, I think, is so important because many tribes are fighting land dispossession right now. And I know on my reservation, we have a lot of non-native farmers on the Wind River, and talking about it can be quite difficult, quite politically charged. And so the work becomes quite local and quite difficult, and especially if you're a native person, talking about your tribes and this long history of dispossession can be quite difficult, to say the least. So I'm just curious, you talk in the book about your coverage at the UN and talking with those native people around the world. I know that that gives me a lot of hope, is talking to other native people and getting to know their communities and how they're fighting back against land grabs and stuff like that. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your experience reporting and connecting with other Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I should say first that Taylar, I think, is a lot braver because, like she said, she lives on the Wind River Reservation. And so you're dealing with these ranchers in your community. I'm in New York, and I'm able to travel to these places and kind of go in and out. But the UN forum that you're talking about is the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that Taylar and I have reported on for a few years, and it's an annual forum in New York City that's 2 weeks at the UN headquarters in New York, and it's thousands of Indigenous leaders, experts, activists from all around the world, and they're all coming to the UN to try to amplify their message, to make connections, to sometimes ask for money, sometimes call out human rights abuses. And it's kind of a weird space for that reason, because there's so many different people coming from so many different places, asking for so many different things with such high hopes. On the other hand, it's the UN, so it's just like a lot of meeting rooms, a lot of talking. It's kind of like everybody goes in there like, I know nothing happens here, but I'm here anyway. And what I think despite that is really powerful is that people are using the UN as a space for connection and solidarity. So what people tell us is that the UN is powerful not because of what actually happens in the meeting room all the time, but what happens outside, right? You go out to dinner, you meet people at lunch, at coffee, during the breaks, and that's where a lot of these conversations are happening, that people are able to form connections. Because I think in so much of this work, it's like people are divided, and you're told that there aren't similarities between, what's happening in Wyoming and what's happening in, let's say, an Indigenous community in Ecuador or in Kenya. But when people find these spaces to gather and meet, you're able to see, oh, there actually are a lot of similarities, and our fight is very similar, and we could maybe work together, share solutions, and do some of this work. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting balance of like the sort of impossible feeling of progress, but also the hope of a lot of these places. And I think that's what is also powerful as a reporter going into these spaces, is that sometimes for us, I think we feel hopeless, like things might not change, but I don't think we're able to have that luxury, to sort of indulge in that, because you're talking to these people who are fighting these issues and they're not, giving up. So they're there. And so I think it's, like we owe it to them to tell that story in the right way.
Yeah, it's really inspiring to go there and see so many people fighting despite it all. And you talk about that in the book, which I found to be incredibly interesting, about this concept of tribal sovereignty, which most of us probably know. It's the ability for a tribal nation to enact their policies and have agency in their homelands. that's what tribal sovereignty is, but you do a really good job talking about this idea of asking the federal government. There's a process to be federally recognized. You have to pretty much ask the United States to give you your sovereignty, which seems kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it? So I'm just curious if you can talk about that, because tribal sovereignty is something that, you know, is good and we should like fight for it, but it's a little more complicated than a lot of people realize. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I've learned a lot from talking to Indigenous folks around the world and, you know, across the country, is that I grew up with, I think, what was, it's nobody's fault, but I grew up with this very limited version of sovereignty where it was just like what you're talking about, federal recognition from the US government. The federal government says, okay, you achieve these, I think it's 7 categories, therefore you're a sovereign nation. And once you're a sovereign nation, you are entitled to these benefits, or you can do these things. And I sort of thought like that was the end of the story, that was it. But you see in tribes across the country now, you know, fighting for their sovereignty, fighting against state government and federal government. And so it's not as simple as like you have it and you're good to go. And even more than that, there are so many different forms of sovereignty. I think that Indigenous people in this country and other countries are trying to push that are more than just what the US government says you can do, or says tribal sovereignty is. And so I think that's another thing that's really inspiring and interesting that I think both of us have been able to do in our reporting, you know, sovereignty beyond like applying to the BIA for a grant, right? I think that's great that that's a thing, but if that's all we're thinking about when we talk about tribal sovereignty is like a relationship with the Department of Interior, I think that's a really limiting way to think about something that can actually be a lot more powerful.
Yeah, and it connects to a very personal story about how you talk about in the book your relationship to your tribal ID card. And I had a similar thing where I'm like, oh, I'm enrolled. Here's my enrollment card. Isn't that great? That relationship. I can show people that I'm Indian, whatever that means. And I think that what I really liked about your book is you put a really nice period on this idea of what Native identity can mean. It can mean getting your tribal enrollment card. It can mean that. But it also can mean doing the work and going to language classes and participating in your culture in a way that's meaningful. And, you know, what I really love about the title of your book is, you know, trying to fight for the land, and however you're trying to do that, whether it's going to language classes or is it going to the UN to report on it, how are you participating in your culture and protecting our communities? So yeah, it's a very personal relationship hidden in this idea of tribal sovereignty. It's almost a self-sovereignty sort of thing. Like, I'm rooted in our communities. So I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think Native identity, like a lot of identities, people, whether you're Native or not, might identify with, it's like, there's a lot of external pressure to be a certain way. And I think especially with Native identity, especially because in many ways it is dictated by these outside forces like the federal government instituting these policies, you know, giving out cards and rules and these sort of things, that, you know, it's a very narrow understanding of what it means to be Native in this country. And I think, like you're talking about the tribal ID card, I think in some ways I kind of hid behind that because I grew up feeling a little bit insecure, like, am I Native enough? Am I really Wampanoag? I don't live on Martha's Vineyard. I don't speak our language. I don't do all these things that from the outside is like, that's what it means to be Native, that you're being told that. And because I didn't have those, but I had the tribal ID card, I think I used it as something, you know, nobody can take that away from me. I might not live on the land, I might not speak the language, but I always have this tribal ID card. And so I think I maybe, because of that, placed sort of outsized influence on it, that I said like, well, that's everything, right? The tribal ID card is like the end-all, be-all of tribal identity, and obviously it's not, and there's so many other ways to do it, and I think a lot of it comes down to sort of finding the way that makes sense to you and to us, and you know, for us, we found a similar way in through journalism and storytelling.
Do you think that you reported out your own identity because I think that I did when I started to be a journalist and started to work on tribal stories. I realized that I was like looking for something. I was trying to find more information about tribal council, about culture, about all these things that might be a little obfuscated if you are struggling with some of those things. So I'm just curious, do you think that being a writer and being a reporter and an editor, you're kind of always kind of searching for that? Are you trying to report out your own identity? Yeah.
It's a good question. I never really thought about it that way. And I think one of the reasons for that is, one, it just feels different when you're, researching and reporting personal issues. But I also think that, you kind of assume that you know your own identity and you assume that you know your own story and you know who you are. But the more I research and the more I ask people questions, the more I realize I really didn't know that much about my own family and my own history. Whereas I think when you're reporting any kind of story that's not personal, you go into it with a sense of I'm just here to learn, and you do your prep and your research ahead of time so you're prepared, but you go into it a little bit like I'm going to listen to people and they're going to tell me. Whereas when I'm reporting or researching on myself, there's sort of this expectation that I know what I'm doing, but the truth is I really didn't. I was going into it relatively clueless, just because of all these assumptions that I had and these things that I was, taught in school. I think that's a big part of it is I didn't have that many models beyond what was taught in school or you see in popular culture. And obviously, school and popular culture are not really great places to learn about Native identity because it's filled with, misguided history, stereotypes, and all of these things. So yeah, it's been an interesting process.
Yeah, and I suppose I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about existing in the spaces that you do, because you're in academia, you're in journalism, and you're also in publishing. You used to be in publishing. I'm just curious, what makes you drawn to these sorts of positions, because there's very few Native people in them, notably, and yeah, I'm curious what draws you to it.
I'm very loosely in academia.
You're a professor.
I adjunct like creative writing classes. It's not that serious. But the other ones, I will, I guess, claim the other ones. But yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting thing, being often the only Native person in the room, whether it's an editorial meeting or, out in the field reporting, you're looking at the other reporters. Even reporting on Indigenous issues, you're looking at the other reporters, and most of them aren't usually Native, or you're seeing, I want to write a story about something, a story that I covered, or a couple stories that I've covered that a lot of other reporters are interested in, like Colorado River, the water rights, or the Klamath Dams. These are stories that have really been reported out a lot in the news, and probably 5% or less are written by Native journalists. So it's an interesting space, and I think you feel a little bit of extra responsibility because of that. Taylar and I have both been really fortunate to work with some great Native editors, which helps a lot. So I haven't had too many of the sort of really bad horror story experiences you hear of, like, you're trying to write a story and your editor does not get it at all, or the outlet doesn't support you. I think I've always worked at places where I feel supported in that work. And I just think it's really important to tell these stories because nobody else will, or they'll do it in a way that I believe is maybe not the best version of that story. So that's what I'm trying to do.
And you do a great job at it. We were talking in the green room about this, but it's interesting to read something and know if a Native writer wrote it. You can just tell because it's usually focused on stereotype or a lot of the negative stereotypes that we face in Indian country. And it's really great to be in places like GRIST that support an Indigenous affairs desk. You'd think it'd be very easy to bring Native people into those spaces, but it can be quite difficult for a lot of the reasons Joseph outlined. So I'm curious, and this might be me reading into it, but I know that I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder when it comes to writing, because I get a little angry. I think that some of like my passion is I get very like protective of our communities, and I get really impassioned when they are portrayed badly. So I'm curious. I read a little bit of anger, and it's a really personal story. I'm curious how you deal with the horrible things that we report on: land dispossession, violence against Native people in the face of climate change, all of those things. I'm curious how you work around that.
Yeah, I think it's a really fine line, and I think as a reporter, you don't want to put necessarily too much of yourself in the story, and we've talked about this a lot. And in this case, for the book, because it's personal, suddenly you are putting yourself in it, and so you can be angry. And it was a question for me: how much of that should I put in the book? How much of that am I feeling? And one of the ways that I thought about it is, I hope that other people, when they read it, will also feel a little angry or frustrated or upset at a lot of these things. And kind of the way I thought about it is I hope that people will get there on their own. I think by laying out the facts and giving some perspective on some of these things, to me, it's very obvious that we should be upset about a lot of this stuff. I don't feel necessarily that I always need to say that. But I do also think that there's a space for anger, and so often we don't allow space for anger. And actually, Taylar and I have had a conversation earlier this year about this. Taylar wrote a really wonderful story about Indigenous heavy metal music, and the music as a kind of means to express anger about climate change and colonialism in these really cool and interesting ways. It's like, I don't know how you describe it, but it's, it's loud, angry music, very emotional, very forceful. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about that, beyond your like Indigenous heavy metal music, climate change, is that we don't have spaces like that to express anger all the time. And so I don't want to close off those spaces, because I think often, people are expected to kind of be nice, play nice, say the right thing, be very polite. And so I think that it's important to really have those opportunities and acknowledge those opportunities, not just say like, okay, we're going to kind of keep it, level-headed here. But I also didn't want to do too much of that in the book, especially because I didn't want to focus only on the negative parts, because those are the things that often get talked about with Indigenous communities, is the bad stuff, the colonialism, the trauma, all these things. And when you're talking about coverage of Native stories by non-Native writers, that's usually what it is. And I really wanted to make space for, optimism and hope amid all of that anger. So I think you have to kind of find a balance of both, and it's hard, yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult, but you ride that line really well in your book. I just want to remind everybody that you can use the QR code or the QR code at your seats to ask a question. But diving back into our conversation, I suppose I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the doing of things, and just talking about Indigenous identity a little bit more. I've gotten the great privilege to work with buffalo out on the Wind River Reservation, and I get to help harvest buffalo. I get to do that. I have that relationship with the buffalo a little bit more than I've ever had before. And this doing of being in communion with buffalo on the land in my home has been so healing and been great for me. And I guess I say that when you talk about how being Indigenous is so much in the doing of things, of being participatory in culture and going and clamming and stuff like that. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about how, again, I guess we already talked about it a little bit, but I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about the importance of acting instead of curious.
Yeah, I mean, the buffalo sound amazing, and I'm hoping that if I take you clamming, I can visit and do the buffalo, and we'll do an exchange. Yeah. But yeah, I think Indigenous identity and Indigenous history is something that is often thought about in this really theoretical way or a very academic way. And I think there are reasons for that, is because I think more than most other groups, Indigenous people need to understand history and legal theory, because it's key to everyday life for Indigenous people in a way that other people don't have to deal with. Like, I deal with this all the time in reporting, that somebody will mention in a quote, you know, oh, it's because of the 1848 treaty and all these, you know, subsequent things that happen after. And the quote is like, nobody wants to read this, you know, and my editor is like, can we like trim this down? And the answer is not really, because those things are so crucial to the issues that we're talking about. And another example that I think of is that there's some international Indigenous laws. There's ILO 169, I think. There's the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And these things sound very abstract, but I know that I think in one of the Sami countries, there's a band that's called ILO 169. They have bumper stickers. Like, it's very real to people. And so Indigenous identity exists in these theoretical academic spaces so often that that's how I sort of thought that was the only way I could understand it and the only way that I could get access to it. But I think that was overlooking what you're talking about, which is the very real lived experience of doing things, that you can't sacrifice the real living experience for the theoretical. You have to have both. Like, the theoretical only matters in the context of what you're doing day to day, and I think there's no better way to do that than to do things with your hands, whether that's clamming or working with buffalo or, you know, working with the community. And there's so many ways to do that, and I think for a long time that's what I overlooked, that I thought I needed to understand all these abstract things before I could do anything else. It's like I need to understand every little historical fact about Wampanoag history before I could try to do anything or have an opinion or get involved. But there are so many other ways to get involved, many of which I think are as impactful, if not more, like working with the land or working with animals or kids or you know, whatever it is.
I really like how you write about your home. Aquinnah sounds like a beautiful place to be, and you write about it with such care. I'm curious, like, how has your community received the book? And yeah, what kind of feedback have you gotten from your family and people who live there?
I think it's a little soon. You know, the book's been out less than a week. So I don't know that. I don't know. Yeah, it's the sweet spot of like everybody's excited, nobody's read it. So I'm like, it's great. All the feedback, 100% perfect. But I, you know, honestly, I do think that whatever people think about the actual book, the community has been really supportive, and people are just really excited. I think there's such a hunger and a need for these stories that we just haven't had. And, you know, I'm not trying to speak for the whole community or even my whole family, or certainly not Native folks broadly. But I just think there's such a lack of representation in some of those spaces, publishing, journalism, academia, that you mentioned, that like we're very excited about any story. And I think hopefully this is, you know, one small part of sort of filling in those gaps that have existed for way too long. But yeah, right now everybody's really supportive and I think just really excited, and like, you know, look at, you know, we got one of our own guys out there doing stuff, talking about stuff. It's great. Yeah.
You start the book with a beautiful story about Mashup the giant, who had a hand in creating the island and Martha's Vineyard. And he gave your people the choice to become a whale or to live on the land as you have been. And I'm curious, do you ever regret not being a whale?
I mean, being a whale sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
You're just out there, you're swimming. Sounds very, you're like, you open the mouth, the whatever whales eat goes in. I don't know anything about whales. But yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's not on me to question the choices that past generations made. I think the way that I think about that story now, so the story of Mashup, it ends, or one of the endings is that Mashup foresees these new people coming to Martha's Vineyard who are going to change the land, change the way we live, and what he does is he leaves with his wife and he gives people the choice to become a whale or to stay, and some become whales and some stay. And I think that one of the things that I arrived at in the book is that it's an ongoing choice. I think the way that I see it is it's just different ways of participating. I don't think the people who became whales were running away, and I don't think the people who didn't want to become whales were in denial or anything like that. They're just finding different ways to respond to the current moment and to deal with these challenges, and that's, I think, what I'm trying to do. So I don't know, I'd love to be a whale, but I'll do that. I wrote the book, and then I'll be a whale.
That sounds really great, especially right now. No problems, just become a whale. Can you talk a little bit about the title of your book?
Yeah, so the title, Nothing More of This Land, comes from this sort of colonial document in the tribe that was written by one of our old tribal leaders, and it's a quote where basically he's saying, like, don't sell the land, don't give away the land, don't lose the land, and if you do, it's over. And any one of us who does that, they're kind of like culpable for that. You know, you have to, it's not just don't sell the land, but you have to hold each other accountable. And I just thought it was such a perfect, almost haunting, like, message from the past about holding on to land and what happens when you lose the land. Because I think in it, you know, it's an old document, so the description is sort of antiquated. It's like, he shall fall. But that really was powerful to me because it felt so kind of serious and final in a way that, like, once you lose the land, and more importantly, you lose the relationship with the land and with each other, it's something that's really, really hard to get back. I think I've arrived at a place where I'd like to believe that it's not impossible to get back, but it's really, really hard. I think you have to hold on to what you have and work on those bonds and connections. Otherwise, you know, you're sacrificing things that generations and generations before you have built. And so that's where the title comes from, that it's, I think, a really beautiful message, but it's also kind of a reminder to myself of what's really important and what's at stake here.
I'm thinking of the part in the book where your community, I believe, is part of the, there's a group who's interested in looking into putting a casino on the island. But then there's a group who's just not interested in that at all, for all the reasons that you wouldn't want a casino in a place where there's very little land that belongs to the tribe. And I really liked how you talked about how Indigenous communities think very different things, and we're not a monolith. And I think it's good to remind ourselves as writers. Sometimes it can be very much like the colonial apparatus versus us, but there's a lot of, like, interesting tribal politics at play in any given Indigenous community. So I really enjoyed that you leaned into that and described what was going on. Can you talk a little bit about that decision? Yeah.
It was really important for me to do that because I think from the outside, people have this expectation that everybody in the tribe is the same, everybody agrees, and the very sort of easy, cheap example I always use is, you know, when you're talking to one of our tribal leaders as if they speak for every single person in the tribe, is like, you know, talking to Donald Trump as if we all agree and he speaks for every single one of us here, which obviously makes no sense. And that example that you're talking about with the casino was, for me, important to talk about because it was one of the first times where I was introduced to that, seeing it up close firsthand as sort of a young adult. You know, I knew growing up that tribal politics was a thing and it was complicated and there was tension. I think anybody who spent any time around tribal politics knows that it's far from, you know, united and everybody gets along and harmonious. There's a lot of tension and strife and disagreement. And I think it's extremely important to talk about that and show that, not just to show that Indigenous people are complex and nuanced and diverse, but also because if you don't show that, you're kind of reducing us to these, like, agentless, powerless, you know, drones just kind of going along and kind of there. It's like, you know, object versus subject. And I think exploring that complexity and tension within my own tribe was important to do as, you know, we go out to other tribes to explore that tension in other places. I think I kind of had to, like, own sort of where I was coming from with that tension rather than just arriving somewhere and saying like, who doesn't get along here? I had to, think about what that looks like personally, because when you are going and reporting on these complex issues, people are nervous or they're hesitant to talk about these things. And I think for me, it's helpful to understand what that feels like to be able to do that work.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely, even if you're a native journalist, sometimes somebody just doesn't want to talk with you because they've been misrepresented before. And to honor that and to maintain that relationship, so maybe down the line you can build trust with a source about a particularly contentious issue in a tribal community, that can be, it's just part of the job. It's just maintaining those relationships. And
yeah, I think one question I get a lot as a native journalist from non-native journalists or just other people interested in it is like, as a non-native person, how do I do this and how do I build trust? As if they think that being native is just like this magical card that unlocks everything. And, I just show them the native card and they're like, I will tell you anything you want. Obviously, that's not the case. In fact, for us being Wampanoag, sometimes I almost feel makes it worse, because I go out to some of these big tribes out west and they're like, Wampa what? Like, I don't know if that's real. Like, Cherokee Nation is like 400,000 people. Aquinnah Wampanoag is like 1,000 people. They're like, I don't know what that is. So it's not this cheat code, and I think that's also really important when we're talking about the diversity and of Indian country, but also the building trust question, which is like the only way to build trust is to build trust. And I think that goes for any field, whether it's journalism or academia or whatever it is. You just have to put in that work, and there's no shortcut to just saying like, I'm native, like give me the goods,
That's a really good way to put it. And I suppose I am thinking of the excerpt from your book that people published about tourism and Jaws, and how Martha's Vineyard was the location for a lot of the scenes shot there. And I guess I'm just curious, and you talk about it in the book a little bit, but what's your relationship to tourism nowadays? Because tourism is a huge booming economy booster in tribal communities, but there's a dark side to it, and I'm curious if you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that there's, very real benefits. My family has a seasonal business on Martha's Vineyard. We rely on tourism. A lot of other folks in the tribe rely on tourism, whether directly or indirectly, through whether it's a seasonal business or just sort of like side businesses along with that. And I think it's something that we really have to reckon with as a community, but also as other communities dealing with tourism. It's very interesting to meet. I met someone the other day, Native Hawaiian, and they're obviously totally different situations, but in many ways very similar, Hawaii and Martha's Vineyard. And so I think those conversations are really, really important to have. And I think it also speaks to the lack of choice that a lot of tribes had. It's like there aren't so many options, so what is the option that we have? And often it's tourism, whether that's in Hawaii or Martha's Vineyard. And I think it would be nice to have more choices. And I think it relates to the earlier conversation we had about sovereignty, because what I think tribes are trying to do, and hopefully will be able to do more and more, is to use that sovereignty to exert power to be able to make choices so that they can do tourism if they want. And if they want to do tourism, they can do it in a way that makes sense for them. Or they could decide, we don't need tourism and we have the resources to do something else that benefits our people, that maybe doesn't come with the harms and risks of tourism. But yeah, so often I think tribes don't have a choice, which in many ways is what happened to the Wampanoag in, the 70s and 80s on Martha's Vineyard, as things like Jaws and other sort of celebrity events were taking off and turning Martha's Vineyard into this desirable vacation spot.
And thinking of tourism and casinos and just the economic engines that sometimes make our communities go. I think, and we both reported on this, right now there's a lot of interest in green energy solutions and stuff like that, but at GRIST, at the place we both worked, we've reported a lot about green energy solutions and who ends up paying the price for some of these things, like to make batteries for cars, you have to dig up a lot of precious minerals. And so I'm just curious if we could talk a little bit about, there's this whole history of tribes getting in on like maybe nuclear or mining or something, and all these companies come in and they're like, well, we'll give you, we'll solve all your economic problems for you. It'll be nuclear, it'll be whatever it'll be. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about your own reporting on green energy solutions at GRIST, and how you talked about choice, but I'm curious if you can walk us through more of that history. Yeah.
I don't remember if you said this, but the term that I think you're hearing more and more is green colonialism. And I think it's a really good term because when you talk to Indigenous people around the world, they talk about, for example, lithium mining, nickel mining, these things that are used for electric vehicles, for batteries, for solar panels, as it's a second wave of colonialism, or a third wave or fourth wave, or however many waves there have been, depending on where you are. And I think it's just a really, really great example of other people trying to make decisions for Indigenous people. And also, I would say the relentless and insidious nature of capitalism, that behind all of this is like people are making money. It's not just that people are invested in green energy or a cleaner world or ending, fossil fuels. I think there's a lot of money here. And most of that money is not going to Indigenous communities who are often victim to these things. Sometimes a little bit of it is, and that's kind of used like to buy their silence in many ways. And you see this around the world, and this is one of those examples where when you go to the UN, I was talking about how people sort of find these surprising connections, and it's almost unbelievable, the same situations that are happening around the world, whether it's offshore wind farm or gold mining or nickel mining or whatever it is. There are all these, or carbon credits is a big one now, right? And so there are all these different sort of mechanisms, but the machine is the same. And actually people have said that to me, that the machine and the thing we're fighting is exactly the same. It just comes in a different form. And so that's why I think the labeling is really important, because if we're talking about let's say electric vehicles, it sounds like, okay, well, that's good, but I could see that there's maybe a bad side. But if you say green colonialism, it's like, okay, that's definitely not good. And so I think it's important to have these conversations in a very straightforward and very direct way to acknowledge kind of this thing that's happening around the world and to help draw those connections. Because often when you're, fighting this issue that's right in front of you, your community's trying to survive, you don't have the ability to like go to the UN and do research and say, oh, what's happening in Brazil is also happening in Sweden. You kind of need help doing that, and I think that's one of the things we're able to offer, hopefully.
In the book, you talk about your friendship with Sophie in Bethel, Alaska, and I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about her and their visit to Alaska, and how you felt connected to your own home, visiting there. So, yeah.
Yes, Sophie is somebody that I met when I was reporting on a gold mine, and this was again another issue of complex tribal government and tribal sort of internal disagreement. Sophie's from Bethel, Alaska, which is in southwest Alaska, and her community, the Alaska Native Corporation, which in Alaska there's a complicated governance structure where there are federally recognized tribes, but they're all very small. About half of the nearly 600 federally recognized tribes in the country are in Alaska, so they're all kind of small villages. And the land and a lot of the money is controlled by these for-profit ANC Alaska Native corporations. And the corporation in this area is trying to build a massive open pit gold mine, which would make a lot of money. But a lot of the tribes in the area, many of whom are stakeholders or shareholders in the corporation, don't want the gold mine because they see how it would threaten the environment, harm their way of life, hurt salmon, all these other negative impacts. And that was just really interesting to me to explore that tension. And so I reported on this at GRIST, where we both worked. And then while I was reporting the book, I traveled out there to Bethel in the middle of winter because I wanted to understand a little bit more deeper, not just sort of the political and environmental issues I had been reporting on, but the more community-based parts of it. And it's really kind of, I think, eye-opening as a reporter to, from a distance, report on all this negativity and disagreement. And then you go there and, you know, it's a community. People have to live there, people have to get along, and they still fight or they still disagree. But, you know, when you're reporting from a distance and it's kind of talking heads and it's like, this person said this person said this, it's very different than when you're there walking around, going to the stores, going to the restaurants. And yeah, I just had a really kind of beautiful experience. In Bethel, we also took a small plane up the river to a smaller village, and it was just a really kind of beautiful experience. It reminded me of home in many ways, even though it was so different. You know, this is Alaska in the middle of winter, which is very different from Martha's Vineyard, obviously. But there were some little moments like going into one of the village stores, which, you know, people may know in Alaska, these small village stores play a really important role because delivery, you can't just order online, you can't just go to the store. Everything has to get flown in, boated in, snow machined in, and the stores are very, very expensive because it costs so much to get things there. But they're also these really important community spaces, and one of the beautiful things in this store is they had this sign or these photos up on the wall. The village was called Tuluksak, and they had this thing that was like Tuluksak elders, and it was just these portraits of these elders, many of whom had passed away. You could see the dates on the wall, and it was just really amazing to see, but it also reminded me of, in our tribal headquarters, we have these portraits of elders on the wall, and it kind of felt exactly the same, but, you know, one was this store where I'm looking at the prices, and a bag of chips is like $30, and the other one is our tribal government building. And I think it was important for me to see that, to think about all the different kinds of spaces where community can exist, and the kinds of spaces where heritage and memory is preserved. And yeah, it was just a really, really amazing trip, and I got to eat whale and dried salmon and all these other cool things, so that was very special.
I fell in love with Sophie as I was reading, just because she just did a lot of work to both be on, I think, the council in Bethel, and then also the tribal council, which is like, that's a really difficult line to walk. So that was really interesting. But we're gonna ask some questions. All right. Okay. Indigenous people might be conflicted about telling their stories because telling can increase representation and contribute to the movement, but it can also open up more appropriation and weaponizing. What practices do both of you use to help people share confidently, and how do you steward the stories? Steward the stories, I like that.
I like that. I think I'm going to steal it. Helping people tell their stories more confidently, or feeling that trust, I think it just goes back to that question of building trust. And I think one of the problems that journalism has had in the past is not explaining itself very well. I think journalists like to be very quick. They like to assume that they're very important and everybody else thinks they're very important. And the truth is, most of the time journalists are not important. Like, people don't need us. One thing I tell Indigenous people when I talk to them is, you know, I need you way more than you need me. You can continue doing your stuff, living your life, and you could never think about me. But if I want to do my job, I have to be able to talk to you. And so it's, I think, on me to build that trust and build that relationship, and hopefully do it in a way that is true to them and true to their story and honoring their story. And I also think it's just important to explain logistics. Like, how does it work? You know, are you going to be on TV? Are you going to be on the radio? Are you going to be in a newspaper? Is this something that you're going to work on for a year and it'll be published as an investigation? Is this something that is going to be like breaking news tomorrow? I think, you know, you can do all of that in a way that doesn't sort of violate any journalistic ethic. It's just explaining your process. But I think a lot of the time people don't take the time to do that. They're just like, rush, 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 let me get the quote. And I think that's really important. And I think it also shows that you're kind of trying to meet people where they are and meet them at a place that makes sense for both of you. So I try to do as much of that as possible and ask people, like, what questions do you have? Or what is the thing that nobody asked you that you'd like to share? Or I think another good one is like, what do people always get wrong about your tribe? Or another one that can be useful is, are there any sources that you recommend? Because so often there are these history books written about tribes that are from outside sources, and sometimes people in the tribe are always like, that one was no good. But everybody reads it. So sometimes they have one that they do recommend, whether it's written by a tribal member or not. So I think there are all these ways of just having those conversations and taking the time to do that. That helps a lot. But I don't know if you have a strategy.
Co-sign all of that. Yeah, a lot of people, it's weird to be interviewed, and it's odd for people to, especially in radio journalism, going in with a big headphones and a microphone and just like, tell me your story, just is, it can be quite intimidating. So to just walk them through it and be kind. And I think during the writing process, I'm always texting, I'm always like, hey, is this, I'm quoting you, did you mean this? Is this, this is how I'm going to write it. And so I walk them through quotes and everything and try really hard to be as, as reflective as what they meant of their intent as possible. And that takes time and it takes work, but it's really, really important to do, both ethically, and it's just a better story that way. It's a better story. So you interview many people in this book. What was one conversation that you had while working on and researching this book that really stayed with you?
Honestly, all of them. I talked to a lot of people from my own tribe, my own family, and all of that was very, very meaningful to me, and I learned a lot, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to sort of go deeper into our story, but then also the sort of further out, like meeting Sophie in Alaska, all of that stuff I think was so powerful to me because it was so different in many ways from my own experience, but then also in those differences, finding the similarities. And so I think it's really all of that put together, and I kind of keep saying this, but there was a time in writing the book where I just wanted to take everything everybody was telling me and like, that's the book. Like I would just like to share what smart people have told me. And I think that's sort of a sign that I was talking to the right people, but it's also, I think, just a sign of how little of this there is out there. And that's not to say that me or you are the only ones doing this, but I think the fact that I can just almost talk to any Native person and they have a story that I think has not been told enough is just a sign of how much more we need. Like all of this is sort of out there, and we need it to be told. And sometimes, I don't know if you've done this, but I'll do trainings or workshops for newsrooms, non-Native newsrooms. And one of the things I tell them is there's so many stories. Like the stories are, it's not a challenge to find a good story. The challenge is doing the story right. But if you're looking for story ideas, like it's basically free. There are all these things that we have such a need to be reported on. And yeah, so I just really hope people do more of that. But what I was trying to do with those interviews was kind of a small piece to filling that in, yeah.
A couple people have asked, and I think that I totally skipped over introducing you a little bit more in depth. So can you talk a little bit about your positionality, and a little bit more about your aha moment, like I want to write this book, and a little bit more about you? I think people want you to go a little bit more in depth.
Sure. So I don't know where to start, but to talk about the book specifically and why I wanted to write the book is, so I grew up Aquinnah Wampanoag, but I grew up not living on the island. I grew up in Newton, not far from here. And every summer we would go back and spend time on the island with my grandparents, go to tribal summer camp and participate in these activities. And then we'd go back on long weekends for our cranberry harvest festival. But then I would come back to Newton and always be kind of in school here. And initially I just had a lot of questions about that. Like, what is the tribe? What is my role in the tribe? Who are we? What does it mean to be Wampanoag? And those were kind of the initial questions behind the book. And then, as I got older, my relationship with the tribe changed. I moved to New York, where I live now. And that made me ask new questions of like, well, what does it mean to live in New York and only go home to the island a few times a year? and trying to deal with that relationship. And then as you get older and your relationship with people changes, you know, what does that mean? And then becoming a journalist, it opened up this whole new world, probably like for you, very similarly, of reporting on Indigenous issues around the world and talking to people from all these different tribes. And that was kind of the thing that pushed me to write the book in this version, where I wanted to include my own story of what it was like growing up being Wampanoag and trying to make sense of that, but also putting that story and my personal journey in the context of Indigenous folks across the country and around the world reckoning with these bigger questions. And so it's kind of this whole journey of me personally as a kid growing up in this area, spending time on Martha's Vineyard, and then moving to New York, becoming a journalist, and all of the questions that that led me to. Hopefully that's a little
Hopefully
overview.
that helps, yeah. And you touched on this, and I'm going to compliment you again on your ability to describe identity as an ebb and flow. Like, you never really arrive, you just, you know, you have a different relationship with it. And the assumption is, oh, I'll get there one day. And you're kind of already in that relationship, already doing it, you're already Wampanoag. I'm already Shoshone. Like, it's just, I really appreciated how you talked about that. But you mentioned clamming. Is there another experience or memory that stands out to you as a source of joy?
I would say I had a lot of really great experiences running around, if we're talking about childhood joy, running around with my brother and our cousins around Aquinnah, and we would always get clams, but also we'd get snakes, and we would, like, we're going snake hunting today, and so you'd pull up rocks and doors and boards and all these things and grab the snake and, you know, try not to crush it when you grab it, but also try not to get bit. And, you know, you're running around trying not to get poison ivy or jumping over rabbit poop. And yeah, it was kind of this really great way to have a summer childhood experience. And I think that was the kind of thing that at the time I never thought of that as like a native or Indigenous or Wampanoag experience, because nobody was saying like, this is what it means to be native. But of course, me running around with, you know, tribal cousins and my brother and getting to know the land and our community, now looking back, I'm like, that 100% was part of, you know, a native childhood and part of my growing relationship with what it means to be Wampanoag. And so I think the book in many ways has been kind of like a gift to myself in recovering some of those memories and seeing them for now what I see as what they really were, which is sort of beautiful tribal native childhood experiences, not just kind of random childhood memories, which is what I always saw them as. I think it's really important to acknowledge all of that as part of what it means to be native and grow up native, not just as like native was only when we were doing this one thing and these other things were kind of separate. It's all part of it. So yeah, I really like that question.
Can you speak to the increase in popular media of television as a way of sharing stories and parts of history of Indigenous peoples in the US and even around the world? Do you see this segment growing? It's fine to have shows like Reservation Dogs, but there are so many other stories to hear.
Yeah, Reservation Dogs, if you haven't seen it, great show. There are a few others out there kind of in that similar vein in the past few years. Yeah, I think it's great. And I think what I'm sort of referring to when I talk about we need so many more of these stories and there's a hunger for them is exactly that. And I've talked about this actually not in a native context, but more in an Asian American context, which has also, I think, seen, you know, like with Crazy Rich Asians and a bunch of these sort of new movies and shows, is, you know, the goal is to get to a point where we have bad stuff and stuff that you can like criticize rather than just like we only have that one movie, so we all have to support that movie. We want to get to the point where we have enough that you can say, well, that one was good and that one had these problems. And I think, yeah, I think it's just part of sort of a growing journey. And yeah, I think Reservation Dogs and these other stories are really important. But yeah, I hope there'll be more telling different aspects of those stories, and so that you can get to that point where you can say, okay, Reservation Dogs is not a native show. It's, let's say, a show about growing up as a young person in native Oklahoma, or it's about a very specific experience, rather than having Reservation Dogs or my book or your reporting or anything speak for the whole community. You're able to have different aspects of the community shown. So hopefully we're I think we're getting there, and we'll continue getting there.
How might Indigenous people from other lands learn more about how to be an immigrant rather than a settler when they are relocated in the U.S.? So other Native people in the United States on not their homelands, yeah.
Yeah, this is a really good question, and something I've thought a lot about in our international reporting. I mean, I think a lot of it just has to do with the problems of the way history is taught in this country, that we don't have a lot of space for Indigenous people outside of a very specific meaning of that, and most of the time that excludes Indigenous people from other countries. We only understand Indigenous or Native to be like, you're from here, you're probably Navajo or Cherokee or something like that, Lakota maybe. And you know, it's just a few tribes and a few ways of life that are recognized as being Native, not these, say, Wampanoag or Shoshone or Arapaho or Indigenous from another country. So for people coming, I think it's to seek out those other stories like Reservation Dogs or Taylor's reporting or whatever, or this book, or whatever it might be, to find stories that are kind of going against that American narrative of what it means to be Indigenous. Because again, I think that's it's a tool used to divide us, right? To say that Indigenous people in the US and Indigenous immigrants are different. You know, of course there are differences, but in many ways it's the same story, it's the same fight against colonialism. So I think the more you can connect over that, I think the more you're able to find that kind of solidarity.
This might be one of our last questions, but it's easy for non-Native people who mean well to look at Indigenous peoples as resources, but that can place the onus of education and managing others' feelings on Indigenous people. What are ways that non-Native people can turn this around? How can we support Indigenous people day to day?
I think the first step is, not asking Native people to do everything. And that's one of the reasons I really like this question I mentioned earlier of asking people what are resources you recommend. Because in a sense, that is asking them to do a little bit of work, you know, maybe put together a reading list or something. But it's also a way of, you know, I don't need to have a whole hour-long conversation with you when there's a book you recommend. You know, I can go read that book and then come back and ask you better questions. So I think that's one. I think the other one is just asking people, if you really want to know what Native people need and help them, you just have to ask, right? And not assume or try to place your own sort of idea of what that might look like on them. I think you just have to ask and let people advocate for themselves and speak for themselves. And sometimes it's making space for people to be able to do that. I was just having a conversation about like volunteer boards in like a local municipality, for example, where they're like, we really want more Native people to join, but they never do. And then it turns out it's because they don't feel welcome, or they don't have time, or they're busy doing other things. So there are all sorts of ways that you can work to support. You know, this person I was talking to was thinking about offering stipends for being on this board to make it more possible for people to participate, so they don't have to make the choice between work or participating in this board. So there are all kinds of ways that you can, I think, not just make space, but make space like really, really accessible.
Who are your favorite Indigenous authors, fiction and nonfiction?
Great question. Taylar Stagner, number one. But in terms of books, there are a lot of really great new books out there. There's one from our tribe, Linda Coombs wrote a book. I think it's Colonization and the Wampanoag Story. I'm looking at someone who will know the title. There's also a couple novelists out there. There's Morgan Talty, who's Penobscot, who writes really amazing fiction. There's John Hickey, who has a new book out called Big Chief. There's some really, really amazing Native writers, and what I like to highlight about those people is they're working in such different genres. Whether it's a novel, there's some really great horror novelists or horror fiction writers out there. Then there's Linda, who's doing both history and reimagined history. And so I think Native literature is often thought of as like just history or academic texts or maybe kids' books, but not kind of the types of books that people are reading, like memoir or literary fiction. A great Native memoir that came out, I think, last year is Whiskey Tender by Deborah Jackson Taffa, which is a really good one. So yeah, there's a lot of different things out there that I think are worth exploring.
Yeah, and one final question. What do people get wrong about your tribe that you hope people take from your book?
I think the most basic one is just that we don't exist. One of the things that I've wrestled with is we learn a lot about the Wampanoag people like 400 years ago, and then almost every person in this country in elementary school, you learn about the Pilgrims, the first Thanksgiving, surviving the first winter with the Three Sisters and all this stuff. And then you never hear about Wampanoag people again. And I hope that at the very least this book is, kind of a testament to the wrongness of that, and that we do still exist, we're still here. And maybe more importantly, that since then we've evolved, right? And that we've changed and we continue to adapt and evolve and try new things and argue with each other, argue with outsiders, and try to do all these different things to improve and protect our community. So yeah, hopefully that's a takeaway.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and everybody should buy a copy. Joseph will be over there signing directly after this, and we're also having a reception in the back, so please stick around for that. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it. And yeah, Joseph, Lee.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, everyone.